failed, but when the industry started drilling horizontally in that layer that's below the sharp contact, then they started to succeed. And so in a sense then, the surface infrastructure for a Utica well is, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between that and a Marcellus well. So in terms of surface disruption, to use that term, or surface presence, you're not going to be able to tell the difference at all.
Two more questions. Do the gas companies typically assess the various frackability factors that you listed, for example, water saturation, prior to investing in a drilling operation?
The answer is you can't make those assessments without at least drilling and going there. It's impossible to make those measurements remotely. It requires wells and real data.
Is there still a place for economic production of upper Devonian or shallow gas and the relatively low volumes these wells can produce?
Probably not at this gas price. There are a number of layers in the Devonian that are above the Marcellus. The Genesee, Burkett in Pennsylvania is what it's called, the Rhine Street, for example, the Dunkirk, Huron, all of those are prospective in certain places. But a lot of these shallower plays require the right price. Now, I should point out that in terms of regulation, I'm not sure that it's a good idea to produce a gas shale that's, let's say, less than 4,000 feet deep, or something like that, which means in McKean County, the Marcellus is at 4,500 feet. That's about as shallow as you want to go. And up in New York State, there's a lot of room in New York State where the gas is that shallow. And so you're not going to see drilling at that level. I think there's some depth that's on that order that probably gas shouldn't be produced from, because there are infinitesimal, but no, there are small but finite risks.
Speak to the 77 plus earthquakes caused by fracking in the Utica and Bolin Township, Ohio, by Hillcorp Energy Company.
Yeah, it is very interesting to note that there are several types of industry-induced earthquakes right now. First of all, the most remarkable are those that are coming out of Oklahoma. And there, the process the industry is using is they've learned that if they deplete reservoirs from water, they're physically pumping water out of fairly porous, permeable rocks like limestone to produce oil. And they've learned that if they produce enough water, then oil will eventually flow. Problem is, they have a lot of this water they brought to the surface that can be disposed of in no other way than re-injecting it down other wells. And they're re-injecting huge volumes. And the United States Geological Survey has made it very clear that when injecting water, there is a direct relationship between the size of the potential earthquake. You can make a plot, it's a linear plot. If this is earthquake size and that's the amount of water injected, the further you go out this way, the further up on that scale you go. Now, in terms of the Ohio earthquakes, for example, the Youngstown earthquakes were also earthquakes generated from injecting of water in wells. And what we also do know is that with each fracture stimulation, there are lots of thousands and thousands of earthquakes generated. You can't feel them because they're called, and for that reason, they're called micro-earthquakes. And earthquakes actually have a scaling law associated with them, which is something like for every 10 earthquakes of a certain size you produce one of another size. And that goes on up to the point where seismometers put on the surface can detect in the subsurface earthquakes that you can't feel. In fact, this is a technique known as microseismic. And it is true that with a lot of the companies, they've actually gone out, they've set out specifically to detect these things that are called micro-earthquakes. And I'm not certain, you asked a question about the Hillcorp.
That's those earthquakes, yeah. I lived 2
How many were actually felt, though? Because I
How
don't,
many were felt? At least 7 that I know of.
yeah, so they were really small.
No, they weren't really small. My basement foundation was destroyed by those earthquakes. When it rains, water pours through the walls of my basement. My drywall was all cracked, and you know what kind of response I've had from Hillcore, ODNR, PADEP, my insurance company. Well, I can't think of a polite way to put it, so just, you know, it's, oh well. I guess I'm part of the sacrifice.
Where'd you come up with that word?
Where'd I come up with what word?
The word sacrifice.
I do believe it was yours, where you said there's bound to be sacrifice zones. I've lost my organic farm. It's been in my family for 100 years. My son cannot raise a family on this farm because of the pollution from the cryogenics plant and all the fracking wells around there.
Peter, excuse me, I have one clarifying question. When you were talking about injection, was that disposal injection of water, or was that fracking?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the disposal injection of water.
Not
And
something as the
during
public
disposal of fracking water in Ohio, for example, there were a couple orders of magnitude more water put down each well, and that's what generated the failed earthquakes.
No, sir, sorry, I don't want to argue with you, but those Youngstown earthquakes were from injection wells that were 14 miles above me. I'm talking about the Poland Township earthquakes, the ones that the research studies just came out of with Columbus. Every time they pulled the trigger on the perf gun, they caused an earthquake.
Well, that's true, but it wasn't, you couldn't feel it.
Well, it knocked me to the ground twice.
Okay.
And it destroyed, oh, next question, huh? There you
There
go,
are no
sacrifice
more
zone.
questions. It's 20 after 8, so I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. So please join me in thanking
Yep.
Dr.